Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pathways to Family Wellness podcast. My name is Dr. Brendan Reardon, pediatric and family chiropractor. And joining me today, one of my favorite guests on the show, we have Peter Gray, PhD, who's going to be joining us. And we're going to talk about play. We're going to talk about learning, childhood education. So, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to do so.
Absolutely. I know your work has been influential on so many people, my own family and the way that we look at education and play and children being free to play, which is the title of one of your great novels there as well, your books. And so I'm going to read your introduction real quick here, your bio, and then we will jump right into it. So Peter Gray is an American psychology researcher and scholar. He is a research professor of psychology at Boston College and the author of an introductory psychology textbook. He is known for his work on the interaction between education and play and for his evolutionary perspective on psychology theory. So I've had a chance to read, you've got a Substack now. I've had a chance to read several of your entries in the Substack, and there's a lot of them that I've thought have been very interesting. But one of them in particular, you were talking about, and I forget the exact context, but about just the absurdity of imposing structure on play for children, especially at recess time. And so I'm wondering what the inspiration for that was, if there's any new information or research that came out that led you to decide to write on that, or if it was more of a passing thought that went by.
Well, of course, I've given a lot of thought to the general issue of children's play, and I've been concerned about the limitations both in time and in freedom of recess for a long time. I think what stimulated that particular Substack letter was I had was sent by a person, don't remember what her position was at some school, I think in Maryland, who sent me a 4-page list of the rules for recess
That's right. Yes.
at her school. Listed something like 46 points,
Yeah.
which the playground and supervisors were required to enforce. Uh, some of them absolutely ridiculous sounding, like explaining that if you're going to use the monkey bars, you have to put your thumbs around the bar and not just hold on with a grip with your thumb on the same side of the bar as the rest of your fingers. uh, Instructions about where you can throw balls and where you can't, and you have to stand if you're to use any item of equipment, you have to stand in line and wait your turn.
Oh
Just
gosh.
a whole set. And one of the striking things was the word insubordination. Can you imagine using the word insubordination in relationship to talking about elementary school children? That you would, if they are insubordinate and don't follow the rules, they should be sent in to speak to the principal or to some, this is, I'm sure that prisoners have a lot more freedom,
Oh, sure.
out on their playground than we allow our children. So it's not just that we've greatly reduced the amount of time they have for recess. They hardly have time to get out there and get anything going. And then some schools are so restricting what you can do. You can hardly call it play when there are that many rules.
Yeah, and you can just imagine, oh, little Johnny, I saw you improperly wrapping your thumbs around the bar. It's time to go talk to
That's
the
right.
principal about, you know,
If I'm intrigued, I don't think I put it in there. I was thinking, well, maybe they should have a rule explaining how to walk properly. If you're going to
yes.
walk, you have to put your left foot forward, make sure that that foot is firmly planted on the ground before you move your right foot forward in
Yes.
front of your
Yes.
left foot, and make sure that foot is firmly planted on the ground. It says you're treating kids like they're idiots.
Yeah. Well,
It's
even cadets in the military don't have that many rules around how conduct. It's incredible. And that's
so.
just it, right? And I think what you said, right? Treating children like they're idiots. I feel like a lot of the rules that get placed are with that assumption in mind, right? That these children can't make good choices on their own. They don't know how to behave
Right.
properly, and they need to be controlled to the best extent possible in order for us to get a good outcome, right?
I think that's right. And I think what happens is, of course, in any kind of activity, and especially in children's play, sometimes somebody's going to get hurt. It just happens, right? Sometimes somebody gets hurt. And so I think what happens in a lot of schools, somebody got hurt.
Yeah.
probably playing on the monkey bars, falling off because they didn't have their thumb around this way. So now
Sure.
there's a rule. Everybody has to put their thumb around.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
For
it
all
happened
time,
one time out of, and the kid maybe got a skin knee. I'm making this up, but I'm
Right.
assuming that this is the kind. I know of at least one school where the woman who's a playground supervisor told me she does everything she can not to enforce the rules. But the one of the rules is that you can't pretend that you're a video game character. Oh, now why? Children have always in their fantasy, they pretend they're somebody that has come
Yeah.
from their fictional life, from the now from what they're reading, from the stories they hear, from television they watch, from and why not from video games? Only thing I can imagine is if somebody was at some time pretending to be a video game character and did something inappropriate. Who knows what it was?
Right.
And so now there's a general rule. You can't pretend there are schools that outlaw tag, believe it or not. I mean, tag is the universal game for
Tag is
basically
outlawed.
all
Yes.
mammals. This is
Yes.
how mammals keep in shape. This is it's not just humans. They all play tag. This is the universal game. No tag at recess, and
Oh
I
yeah.
once asked why, and the answer I got was a little bit ambiguous, but it had something to do with touching. Tag involves touching. And I wasn't sure if it's because touching possibly has a sexual connotation or because the
Huh.
touch might end up being a little bit of a push. And maybe at some point somebody fell down being
Yeah.
touched in tag. This is how it's just crazy.
Yeah.
It's not play at all when you're controlling people that way.
Well, we've got two dogs at home and they play their equivalent of tag. One will chase one and then one chases the other and they run in
Oh, yeah.
circles around the yard and they take turns and one might
Yeah,
play a little bit too rough and the other one gives feedback and might yelp or something and then they back off and it's a back
right,
and forth learning that happens that way about the
right.
boundaries.
It's
Yeah.
it's the most natural game possible. It's
Yep. Yeah.
I once wrote an essay on the tag is the universal game that underlies essentially all sports. If you look at all other sports, whether it's football or baseball or soccer or any, they're all a version of tag. It all involves chasing somebody
Yes.
and catching them or getting the ball away from them.
Yeah. And not to mention the lack of predictability that can happen with that must be really healthy for a child's
Right.
brain as well.
Oh,
The
yeah.
idea of structure. Here's an interesting example. At our practice, we take care of a lot of children that might be neurologically diverse in different ways. And so there was this one child who was having trouble sitting still in class, according to their teachers. And so instead of getting more recess, recess was taken away so the child could spend more time inside. And lo and behold, the behavior didn't get better. It just got worse. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, if that child is, quote, misbehaving, they need more recess, not less recess. That should have been what was given. But instead of recess, the one thing that was a unstructured outlet that would have allowed the child to then probably focus a little bit easier because they just run around outside was taken away from them. And I thought this kind of defines a lot of the way that we're looking at children. It's like that.
It definitely does. And
Yeah.
this is not, I think it's important that people who aren't as old as I am realize that this has not always been true. So, I've talked about recess when I was a kid, and I remember very well in fifth and sixth grade, we had 6-hour school days, much as many schools have today.
Yeah.
2 of those hours were outdoors playing.
How many of those were outdoor?
2 hours.
Wow.
We
Okay.
were indoors only for 4 hours, never more than an hour at a time.
Wow.
So we had half-hour recess in the middle of the morning, half-hour recess in the middle of the afternoon, and a full hour of lunch. We would eat our bag lunches very quickly and be out playing. And I don't remember anybody watching us during those periods. We were
Yeah.
free to play in whatever way we wanted. This was in fifth and sixth grade. I was at the same school and even had the same teacher for those 2 years. I don't know to what degree this was unique, but in other schools I was at, I don't remember the exact amount, but it was close to that. We had a
Yeah.
lot of time outdoors. But the point I want to make related to your story about this kid who couldn't sit still, that same teacher, even though we were never indoors more than an hour at a time, she would once in a while say, "Oh, I can see that you're all restless. Why don't you just all get up
Yep.
and let's take a 5-minute break?" And she had hula hoops in the room and
That's
things that
great.
we could do with. And then she said, "Okay, now you can sit down and you can probably focus on what we're doing here."
Yeah.
She had an understanding of kids,
Yep.
and
Yep.
it was at that time in history, teachers had control of what they did in the classroom. They weren't being dictated to in the same rigid way by the higher ups in the school that they are today. So it depended a lot on who you had as a teacher, but
Sure.
a teacher could do, she even did things like once in a while she would organize a a treasure hunt through the whole town that was in, and we would go out and find these things that during the school day. So it was a very different
Oh
time, but
yeah.
but there's no reason, I mean that same town, I'm sure they don't do that now, but it's as sleepy and quiet and peaceful a town as it ever was.
Sure.
But nobody would think of doing these things today. Nobody would think, and this was in northern Minnesota. We would have,
Okay.
we'd be out 2 hours a day in cold weather. We'd have snowball fights. We would we would build forts. We would climb trees. In those days, most boys carried pocket knives, and you would carry them to school. And we
Hmm.
played games of throwing knives during during
Yeah.
recess, not
Yep.
at each other.
Of course.
We weren't idiots,
Yeah. Yep.
but kids were trusted, and I think as a
Yeah.
consequence, we're maybe more trustworthy. When you're trusted, you learn to kind of take care of yourself and other people that you're playing with.
Yeah. There's a lot of important things that you just said there. I think what I was going to ask and you answered about the climate, because it's not like this is, Southern California where it's easy to go outside any time of the year. I mean, there was,
Right.
it's going to be snow and cold weather and rain and cloudy days, and you were still going out and having a good time playing outside regardless. Yeah, my two oldest currently go to a farm co-op type school, and so they're outside most all the day, and they just, we live in the Boston area, so we have winters here, and they just bundle up, and that's what they do, and they still
Yeah.
go outside, and they don't seem any worse for wear from it.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm curious as well. So you had mentioned the day is 6 hours, 30 minutes outside, an hour lunchtime. So basically 4 hours of potential academics. Now, no worse for wear in terms of outcomes for folks that are able to succeed in careers, right? Or learn the fundamentals of math and science, or all the other concerns that people might have as educators of like, wait, they're only getting 4 hours per day. That's not nearly enough. We need more time to get it all done.
Well, this is another realm of my writing. First of all, an enormous amount of that time in school is wasted.
Yep.
It's just purely wasted. But secondly, the things that are important to learn, and it's important to learn how to read. It's important to learn how
Hmm.
to write, or in these days type. It's
Yep.
important to know how to do the kinds of calculations that are useful for everyday life. And these things are not difficult to learn.
Yep.
Kids can learn. In fact, I read quite a bit about this. Years ago, you don't see it so much today, but years ago, there were quite a few experiments, even done in public schools, where the experiment was basically, what if we taught less of this? And or we started teaching it later in
Uh-huh.
their career.
Uh-huh.
And the result was more learning.
Isn't that interesting?
Because when you teach more of it, or when you try to start it too early, you're burning kids out and they turn off to it. When there's less of it, this is not hard to learn this stuff. It's really not that hard. I mean, think of learning to read. Think how easy learning to read is, just from a theoretical spec. perspective than it is to learn your native language
Oh yeah.
orally, right? And all kids learn their native language by the time they're 2 or 3 years old, unless there's something wrong with their brain.
Right.
They all learn it. And so all you're doing in reading is you're translating the visual code into the oral code. There are lots of studies showing, and I've done some studies of how kids learn to read when they're not going to school at all. And once they get interested in it, once they want to learn how to read, it it is for most kids a very fast process. We
Yeah.
make it hard in
Yep.
school by forcing it on kids who aren't interested in it, reading stuff they're not interested in, reading not even for meaning, but just to translate the sights to sounds. And starting it too early. I mean, some kids learn how to read. I had a younger brother, and my own son could read very well by the time they were 4 years old. So sometimes that happens, but that was totally self-motivated. Nobody was teaching.
Sure.
They just got interested in reading. And my studies of kids who are involved in self-directed education, either in a democratic school or through homeschooling by the method of unschooling, where they're not given formal lessons,
Hmm.
it indicates that when kids become interested in learning how to read, and that can occur at a wide variety of ages, they learn very quickly
Yep.
and with very little help. Sometimes no help. Sometimes it's just unclear how on earth they learn. So we are making it difficult. I'm also convinced, and I've written also about this on one of my Substacks, as well as in one of my Psychology Today blog posts, that that we are creating dyslexia. We're creating what we call dyslexia by forcing little children to go through the motions of reading and really turning them off to it. And it
Yeah.
becomes an emotional issue. I think that the great bulk of the cases we call dyslexia are the result of mental block to reading and an
Hmm.
emotional abhorrence of it because you've been shamed, you felt shamed. It's not the deliberate teachers are deliberately trying to shame the kids, but if you're being forced to read out loud in front of other kids and you're not as good at it as other kids are,
Sure.
this is a can be a traumatic experience. So I did a kind of an informal study where I contacted parents who were homeschooling their kids, but whose kid had been in school before and diagnosed with dyslexia, and then they took the kid out of school, unable to read, and asked them, "So did the kid eventually learn how to read, and how?" And what I found was there were something like 11 or 12 cases, and in essentially every one of them, what they said was what I discovered was that the problem was not that my child had a cognitive problem that made it difficult for the child to read. It was that my child had an emotional problem about reading.
Yep.
And I just had to lay off. I had to not talk about reading. I had to just say, well, I'll read to you. And at some point, the child got interested in reading. The, the fear of it declined, and the child then learned, either with or without help.
Yeah.
So
And
all this forced teaching is having negative effects. And the more time we spend on some subject, the less interesting it becomes to the kids, and the less likely they are to actually really learn it in some kind of deep way.
yeah, we noticed that with with my oldest son who's almost 11 now. When he was in third grade, they were asked, and it's innocent enough, but they were asked just to keep track to read 30 minutes a day and have a parent sign off on it and keep track of that. And I know it's done with the best of intentions, just for the
Sure.
exposure like that, but there was always resistance because it was an assignment that needed to be signed off on. There was almost always resistance to it. And then once we did a more like now that he's in a more of a homeschool co-op, he loves to read. I don't keep track of the time. I'm pretty sure it's quite a bit more than 30 minutes a day if I were to keep track of the time. But he loves to read and he explores a variety of different types of books, and And it's not something that we have pushed in any way. It's just he just enjoys getting information that way now. He likes to read the stories or read about football players and memorize statistics and all kinds of different things like that. But it's been entirely self-directed in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, that's consistent with what I have observed too. I generally, so the kids that I've followed up, um, who are attending a democratic school that doesn't teach reading unless you ask for some help with it. And kids learn to read at various ages whenever they're interested. The first observation is the school that I'm most aware of, the Sudbury Valley School. There's never been a case of anybody not eventually learning how to read. Never. They've
Yep.
had hundreds, including many kids who've been diagnosed with dyslexia before they ever came to the school,
Isn't that
all learned how
interesting?
to
Yeah.
read. But the other thing that I've observed is they really tend to be big readers. If you learn how to read in fun and you learn how to read in a way that's not painful or shame-inducing, reading is a wonderful skill, and it
Yep.
opens up a whole world of possibilities.
Yeah.
So kids, yeah, they like reading. They don't have any negative feelings about reading. It's not work for them to read. It's
Yeah.
play. It's fun. It's so,
And
oh,
would you say that's the same for most subjects as well? Let's say there's a science experiment or an exploration into different other avenues, mathematics, anything like that.
absolutely. I mean, mathematics is, almost wish we would ban the word mathematics, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
What does it mean to talk about kindergarten or preschool children learning mathematics?
Yeah.
We used to call it arithmetic, right? I mean,
Well, and of course, parents get very excited about that.
uh,
Like, oh, my
oh,
kindergarten's going to be learning
mathematics.
math. This is
It sounds
wonderful.
so academic and advanced and so
Yes.
on and so forth, and
Yes.
scary, right? I mean,
Yes. Yes.
what you're really learning is, it's important to know your numbers at some point, but I don't know any kids who don't pick it up.
Yeah.
You learn numbers, they're
Yep.
interested in numbers, you play games that involve numbers.
Sure.
You play games that involve counting spaces, even something like Candyland. You get the idea of what it means to add.
Hmm.
At some point, if you're interested in cooking, you're cutting recipes in half.
Yep.
You learn the math that you and I and 99% of people in the world use. It's all math we would learn in our daily life anyway. That's the math we remember.
Yep.
The math that is taught in school that goes beyond that is forgotten by 99% of people who went
Sure.
through it.
Yep. Yep.
One of the questions I like to ask sometimes when I'm speaking to a group of people is, so do you remember quadratic equations? Oh yeah, everybody remembers quadratic equations. Is there anybody who's met a quadratic equation since you left school?
Yep.
Maybe one hand goes up out of 100,
Yeah, you've had a chance to
Anybody
apply it.
remembers what it is? Can you tell me what it is?
Yep.
Even that one hand went up, couldn't remember what it was.
Oh, that's a
And
bear of an equation. Yeah.
I've talked to scientists. You know quadratic? No, no. I do a
Yeah.
lot of math, but it's all math related to my particular kind of work, and I had to learn it in relation to my work. Now
Yes.
that's what unschoolers do. That when you need to know math for something that you do, you learn the math related to what you do, and it's not
Yes.
hard to do. I mean, it's some of it is hard to do, but you do it because it's meaningful to you and you dig yourself into it and it has application. You're not just learning it in case sometime, who knows when, there's
Yeah.
some possibility that I might have to know what a quadratic equation is. The other thing is that 99% of the teachers who teach quadratic equations don't really know what they are. They're just teaching formula.
Yes. Yeah. And now I'm curious then, what's the motivation or drive behind having such a broad-based education like that to learn a variety of skills that, like you're saying, 99% of people, it's not going to be applicable and isn't really going to make a difference in someone's quality of life one way or the other, right? It's hard to imagine someone on their deathbed being like, I really wish I'd learned the quadratic equation better. So, yeah.
I think what it is that the whole education system has become an ingrown world of itself, which is pretty much separate from the rest of the world.
Yes.
So if you ask a kindergarten teacher, So what's your goal? What are you trying to do in kindergarten? They'll say, I'm trying to prepare my children for first grade.
Mm,
You ask the first grader what they're doing. Oh, I'm trying to prepare my child for second grade or for elementary school in general. You go on to the high school teacher. Oh, we're trying to prepare our children to be able to apply to college and go on to get into a good college. Almost nobody even talks about preparing for the real world. I'm trying to
yeah,
prepare better citizens. I'm trying to help people develop the skills they need to navigate life in the real world.
sure.
The person who says that almost has to realize, wait a minute,
Yeah,
if that's what I'm doing, then why am I doing these things in the classroom?
sure.
It used to be that schools were a little bit more preparing for the real world. We would have, for example, shop classes and we would have
Hmm.
cooking classes. Admittedly, there was some segregation there. The boys would take shop classes and the girls would take
Sure.
home ec, but you didn't have to do it that way. You could have everybody doing some home ec and everybody doing some shop
Hmm.
classes, and
Hmm.
and at least some of that time, you in school you would be learning some useful stuff.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, our local Waldorf school has that as a part of their curriculum, right? So they've got, everyone goes to a shop class. They can do
Yeah,
some knitting or sewing, some home ec, in addition to other, so and I think when you look at their mission statement, it's to create, like self-reliant,
right,
confident, like all these abilities and skills that we would want as parents for our children, not just so they can make it to the next step,
right.
right? It's this weird like inbred sort of like we're just going to make it to the next step, to the next step, to the next step.
And even this idea that you have to do this, you have to do first grade before you can do second grade, or you have to do high school before you can go to college. It is belied by the fact that, as I've studied kids going from unschooling directly to college who never took a course.
Yep.
And they get into college and they do fine.
Sure.
There are cases of kids who've gone to the Sudbury Valley School, never studied anything formally. Maybe they're 11 years old, so if they went to the public school, they would be going into, I guess that would be fifth grade or sixth grade,
Hmm.
fifth grade, I think. They say, I want to go to public school next year. All my friends are going to public school. I want to go to public school. So they go to fifth grade and they do fine.
Yep.
That's,
Yep.
it's, you kind of, they kind of assume people have forgotten a lot of stuff anyway and start
Yep.
teaching over. And I know as a college professor, it doesn't surprise me that people can go into any first year class, any first year course in college without having taken a high school course related to it.
Yep.
I know that's true because no professor assumes that the kids remember anything from their high school course, and most professors are arrogant enough to think that if they did learn something there, it was probably wrong. And
Yep.
so they have to
Yes.
relearn it anyway. So they all start from
Yeah.
scratch. They may teach at a faster and more intellectually advanced pace than a high school course would be,
Yeah.
but there's no assumption that you have to know particular things. And if the other thing I found in talking with kids who've done this, who've gone directly to college without taking any high school or even grade school courses in some cases, and I say, well, how do you deal with the fact that other people, aren't, don't you feel behind? And some of them will say, I worried that I would be behind.
Mm. Yeah.
But I really wasn't that much behind. And sometimes the professor would use some term or assume we knew something. So I would just look it up. You know?
Yep.
So you're in a biology class and the professor talks about
Yep.
mitosis and you've never heard of what mitosis is. Cool. So nowadays you just pull this thing out,
Yep.
and you hit
Exactly.
mitosis. You've lost about 5 seconds of the lecture as you've looked up mitosis.
Yep.
You know, formerly you had to write it down, go to the library or look it up in the dictionary after class and catch up that way. But this makes it so much easier.
Even with the quadratic equation example, the phone can know all of these things as well.
To
It's
know the phone can know. The phone can tell you what it is, and it can solve them for you
yep.
if you
Yep.
want.
Oh, it's interesting to hear you say that as well. My oldest has had an interest in going to our local public middle school for middle school. He's in, fifth grade right now. And it's
Yeah,
less about the academics and more he just has a lot of friends in the neighborhood and he wants to spend more time with his friends
yeah.
there. And so we're trying to, weigh in what that might look like for him and everything like that. And like, just kind of follow his interest with it. But there's definitely that concern of like, oh gosh, are we putting him back into the system that we have been, rebelling against for so long? But we
I,
also feel, I think, that he's got a pretty darn good foundation at this point because he's done a lot of self-directed activities, so he might be in good shape as well, I guess, depending on how they do things. Yeah.
I think it's pretty common for kids who are in some kind of a more self-directed educational approach to think at some point, I really want to try this kind of school that most kids are going to.
Yeah.
And so they go, and as long as they know that if they want to leave it, they can leave it, it's
Yep.
still, in a way, self-directed. I've chosen to do this.
Yeah.
I'm not forced to do it. I think there are different motives. Sometimes it's to meet up more kids. There's some kids who, at the time, years ago, that I did a survey of the graduates of Sudbury Valley School, some who had left the school before graduation to go to a public school did so either because they wanted to participate in a formal school sport at a higher
Sure.
level than they could at Sudbury Valley, where it's
Yep.
just all for fun,
Yeah.
uh, or or they wanted a bigger dating pool, right? I
Yep.
mean, it's almost kind of incestuous to debate to date one
Yeah.
of
Oh
the
yeah.
kids in your little alternative school. So
Yeah.
they wanted a prom, they wanted the rituals that other kids were having. So that was part of the reason. Some kids would go and then they said, well, this is, they proved to themselves they could do it. And then they would say, okay, I don't really need this. I'm going to go back to what I
Yep.
was doing before.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so you've seen kids kind of bounce back and forth and do okay
Yeah.
with that as well. That's good to hear. Yeah. And it does seem like those are the key elements. I mean, it's literally called self-directed education, but that's the key elements of so much of this is that if kids are allowed to be self-directed, they're going to move in a direction of their desires, which will
Right.
ultimately be in their highest good. And all the skills and abilities they would need to develop that educators get so concerned they're not going to develop without forced compulsory education end up getting developed along the way. But it's in almost a meandering way as opposed to this, forced upon way.
There's a whole realm of psychology called self-determination theory, which is not really a theory. It's just it's a fact that which shows in really hundreds of different studies that in all kinds of activities for people of all ages, we all perform better and feel better when we're doing something that we believe we have chosen to do,
Yes.
as opposed to something that we are either forced to do or pressured to do or doing because we feel we need to do it to please somebody else
Yes.
rather than because this is what we know is best for ourselves and we've decided ourselves to do it, either because it's fun or because we understand this is in my self-interest to do this. So studying, if you decide that you want to be a doctor, and that means that you have to go to a four-year college before going to medical school, and that means
Hmm.
you have to pass some kind of a test like a scholastic like a SAT test. You study for it.
Yep.
You find some way, you get out the prep books and study for it, and might not be fun, but you do it, and it's self-directed. You're doing it because you've decided to do it. Nobody's making you do it. Nobody's telling you you have to go to college. This is your decision.
Yep.
And the difference is night and day between somebody who's doing something because they want to do it and something who's doing something because they're being forced to do it.
Yeah, 100%. And on that realm of the length of the school day, kind of a separate piece there. Do you see there being any reform that's happening in terms of like altering the structure of the way that things are done? Do you see the structure becoming stronger and tighter, or do you see things loosening up? Right? Maybe it depends on where we are regionally. I'm not sure if there's any observations you've made.
So I think there was, I think there was a quantum change with Common Core.
Okay.
I think there was a quantum change, beginning around 2010 of, um, there had been gradually increased homework, increased structure, increased pressure all along, but there was a jump in that with Common Core. And the primary reason for the jump was, the primary reason for the jump was that with Common Core, teachers lost autonomy. Uh, Teachers were now being managed, controlled by administrators within the school.
Mm,
Basically, what Common Core did was it resulted in a situation where whole schools, including the principal, including the superintendent of school of the set of schools, as well as teachers, are being evaluated on one measure. How well did the kids do on the standardized academic tests being given to
mhm.
them? And of course, this caused some degree of terror, almost, you might say, in the administrators, and and their approach to it was, well, we can't trust the teachers. The teachers are going to let them get up and play with hula hoops or something like that.
Sure.
We've got to make sure that they're buckling down and teaching this academic stuff that the kids are going to be. And so, what Common Core resulted, at least in many schools, if not most, in rather rigid curriculum standards. So I became personally aware of this when my half sister, who I've been very close to, who was a very happy middle school teacher for 20 years, suddenly resigned.
Yes.
And
Wow.
this was around 2010.
Okay.
And so I talked to her. So what happened? And she said, well, the school changed, as they were getting prepared for Common Core. We now had an administrator in the school, an assistant principal, who would go from class to class and make sure that every class on a particular subject was on the same page as every other
Wow.
class.
Wow.
And this person would tell me if we might be having some kind of interesting discussion about what we talked about yesterday. And this person would tell me, you can't do that. You've got to be this is the topic for today. This is what you've got to be doing.
Wow.
So she was a popular teacher and liked her kids, and the kids liked her because she had this ability to engage them in things that interested them. She was more
Hmm.
interested in their intellectual development, their ability to discuss topics, in their curiosity, and their ability to engage with ideas than she was with whether they met the requirements of page 82 of the of the
Sure.
workbook, right? This is kind of what education ought to be about. And
Yeah.
so the result, she tried to do and she realized she was making the kids unhappy, and she became unhappy, and she became actually seriously depressed. And she
Mm.
took a year of absence for depression. And this was before she had taught long enough to be eligible for full retirement
Hmm.
benefits. At the end of that year, she said, there's no way I can go back.
Wow.
And so she left. Now, I have since learned this happened to a lot of our best teachers across the country. Teachers who had been successful, who were skilled, who were smart, now being treated as if they're just sort of middlings in this process who have to carry out the instructions They're
Yeah.
coming down to them by people who aren't seeing what's happening in the classroom. So this happened throughout the country, and teachers became anxious, kids became anxious, the pressures became more. I recently read an article by somebody who's claiming that this view that Common Core resulted in more academic pressure was wrong because the study shows that homework actually hasn't increased over that period of time. And I have an answer to that. I believe that may be true if you're looking at average homework, because I think that the effect was twofold. I think for some kids, these are the kids who want to get into Yale, right?
Yep.
They greatly increased their homework. They began to really work hard. And for other kids, they just dropped out.
Yep.
And the schools, the other thing about No Child Left Behind is that schools are very reluctant to fail anybody because that becomes a mark of failure for the school.
Sure.
So I think what a lot of kids realized is I don't have to do anything and they'll still pass me. So you've got this split. You've got
Yeah. I
some
see.
kids who are so pressured, they're spending 4 or 5 or 6 hours a night on homework.
Oof.
Other kids who are doing nothing, and it averages out to about what it was
Yep.
before.
Yep. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, and it's almost like the teachers were having a self-directed prior, they were having a self-directed approach to the classroom and were being very successful with that, especially the best ones. And then they were that was
Exactly.
robbed from them and they were treated like idiots, like the way that they look at the kids. Like you
That's
can't
exactly
teach, you won't
right.
be
And
good at educating unless we tell you what everybody needs to learn. Yeah,
I, I've
that's
sometimes given talks to groups of teachers, giving my usual spiel, and the teacher will raise her hand and say, "Well, we're no more free in the classroom than the kids are." And my response to that, I'm not completely sympathetic to that. My response to that is, you are more free because you're free to quit,
yeah. Yeah.
and they're not. And if you're telling me, as many of them have, that pretty much all the teachers agree that these changes have been harmful to children, if that's true, why don't you strike?
Sure.
If one of you fails to follow those rules, you'll be fired. But if all of you do,
Yep.
or even 70% of you do, they can't fire all of you.
Yep.
So I think that I wish teachers would sort of, get their courage up and
Yeah.
strike for something other than their own higher salaries and benefits,
Yeah.
and strike for the sake of the students that are in their classrooms, as well as for their own freedom within the classroom.
Sure. Now, do you see there being positive changes? Like, for example, is this the Common Core where the MCAS test in Massachusetts came from? Is that come out of Common Core, or is that a little bit different?
That's right. MCAS, I think, is part of Common Core.
Okay,
So some states, and to be honest, I'm not sure if Massachusetts MCAS is part of the Common Core, but most states adopted. So what happened with the federal legislation that passed, that ultimately came out of No Child Left Behind, was that states, in order to get federal aid, federal funding to schools, states have to have a system for evaluating schools and teachers based upon the academic performance of schools.
yes, okay,
The federal law doesn't specify how that's done,
okay,
but many states got together, and that's where Common Core came out. We're going to all have, instead of every state creating their own system, let's work together to create a system. So the great majority of states, something like 40 out of the 50 states, have this same system for doing it. To be honest, I ought to know this living in Massachusetts. To be honest, I'm not sure if the
okay,
MCAS are regarded as
okay.
part of the Common Core,
Yeah,
but I think it
I
may be
wasn't
separate.
sure. Well, and then it's
Yeah,
promising because we had that bill that passed that was making MCAS no longer required for graduation, and that's a very recent thing that passed, which is a
right.
good thing because at least at the grassroots level, if enough students decide that they're, or enough parents of students decide that like my child doesn't need to be taking this, then over time the teachers would feel less pressure, one would hope, to teach for the
Well,
test, which would allow a certain little more freedom in the classroom.
well, you would think that would be true, but the reason it may not be true is this, that the purpose of the federal legislation really is to evaluate teachers, not students.
Yes.
And so if those scores go down,
Yeah.
that the students might not suffer,
Yeah. Then
but
the
the school will. The school will be declared failing because because the scores on the standardized tests go down. I know somebody who teaches in the public school in Worcester in a middle school who says that increasingly a problem with MCAS in his school is the kids realize that this has nothing to do with their grade. This
yes.
is just something that they're being asked to do, so they don't take it seriously. And of
Oh,
course,
I
the
see.
staff, the teachers all want them to take it seriously because they'll get a low grade if the
Yes.
scores go down. So they do everything they can to pressure the kids to do well on this.
Sure.
Of course, the other thing they do, one thing that happens is when you're being evaluated in a way, especially if it's an evaluation that you didn't play some role in choosing or agree with, you cheat. This is why kids in school cheat all the time, more and
Yes.
more than ever before.
Wow.
Teachers began to cheat.
Yep.
They began to advise their poor students to stay home the day that the MCAS are being presented, or
Yeah.
they would send notes to those parents saying, MCAS are not required anymore. You can opt out
Oh,
of them, but you
yeah.
got to do this to opt your child out of it.
Okay. Yeah. That's
There
so
was even
interesting.
one case early on in all of this in Florida where a bunch of teachers were caught, or maybe administrators were caught changing the scores, just literally changing the scores.
Wow.
Uh, so,
I
you
mean,
know,
it kind of makes sense, I guess, right there.
yeah, so it
Yeah.
makes sense. It's
Oh,
no
yeah.
different and no neither more villainous or excusable than a
Right.
student, walking in with the answers to the questions on their
Right.
sleeve or
Right.
sneaking their cell phone in and looking up the answers.
Sure. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it makes one wonder if there were to simply be no scores from a school. Like let's say everyone decided they weren't going to take it, what the, if
Right.
enough of that happened, I wonder what the result would be.
What the result would be an interesting question.
Yeah, yeah. Fascinating. Well, I really appreciate you joining me today. I always appreciate your wisdom. It's always a joy to get a chance to speak with you. I'm wondering if there's anything else you think would be good for us to touch on before we part ways here.
Well, there's always more we could touch
Yes.
on, but I think we've
Yes.
I think we've covered probably enough for this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would encourage our listeners to check out your Substack as well. And then you write a blog for Psychology of Today. Is there any other ways that our listeners can connect with your work?
Yeah, so I'm actually not keeping up the Psychology Today blog recently.
Okay,
I
gotcha.
might get back to it. I've been focusing on the Substack, but I do have a website. It's easy to find, just petergray.org or just Google Peter Gray website.
Hmm.
And on that site, you can download many of my academic articles on these kinds of topics as well. There's some videos available there as well as other material about things that I've written. So people who are interested in that, I write even my academic articles I write in a way that I think is pretty readable, so you don't have to feel
Yes.
like you have to be a PhD
Sure.
scholar in order to read the articles or a specialist in the field. I write pretty much the same way, no matter who my audience is.
Okay, great.
So partly I often say because I really don't know any big words. So
Yes. Exactly. Well, I've certainly enjoyed reading your articles as well, and I know that's something many of our listeners are familiar with your work. And for those that aren't, I'd encourage them to check out more of your information and what you have available as well. So thank you so much, Peter. Look forward to connecting with you again soon.
okay, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Brendan. Bye
Indeed.
bye.
Bye-bye.